So, good afternoon and welcome to our seminar today. Our speaker, Yashaswini Chandra, is an affiliated fellow here at CSDS. She has a PhD from SOAS, the University of London, and her research interests include the arts and cultures of the Himalayas, Rajasthan, and Mughal India, animal history, and women's studies. She's the author of The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, and has in fact just returned from the Jaipur Literature Festival where she didn't talk about horses. Before she begins speaking today, I want to tell you that she is about to leave in a few days for the University of Edinburgh, where she is now going to take up her new position in the art history department. So this is her sort of farewell event with us before she makes her way to Scotland. And the topic of her, the title of her talk today is Travel and Space in the Nuns' Experience in Colonial India. You'll speak for...
I'm not sure, 40 to 50 minutes.
Yeah, maybe under an hour, and then we'll have we'll open it up to all of you for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. It has been an honor to be affiliated to CSDS, and it has been a pleasure interacting with the faculty. I found it very inspiring and motivational to be affiliated to CSDS. And I'm grateful to Deepu, Hilal, Ananya, all of you for all the support that you've given me over this time. So this presentation is derived from my ongoing work towards a women's history of colonial India, related as intimate experiences intertwined with colonial spaces. Although I've been affiliated to CSDS for over a year now to work on this project, I'm still in the early stages of my research. The research is planned along ambitious lines, identifying a typology of women who play differentiated roles in shaping the colonial experience and interrogating the nature of their involvement and subjectivity. Moreover, I examine their experiences in relation to the range of spaces shared or constituted by them, encompassing homes, gardens, clubs, churches, convents, workhouses, hospitals, sanatoriums, and schools. This talk is concerned with European women religious, that is nuns or sisters, and is based on an initial draft. So I would be very grateful for feedback. So I'll begin. Once a young nun was laid to rest in the subtropical highland of Cherrapunji near the colonial hill station of Shillong in a region now known as Northeast India. Her grave marked by a small cross-shaped headstone. The name of the sister was given, as were her dates, indicating that she died aged only 23. It must have made for an evocative sight, since it inspired the most popular account of the European nuns' experience in colonial India in the form of a novel called Black Narcissus, many years after it was seen by the author Rumer Godden, then a young woman herself, an 18-year-old Mem Sahab. She had strayed from a picnic and gone down a steep little path when she chanced upon it. It is not all that surprising that the lonely little grave, the final resting place of a short-lived, forgotten Roman Catholic sister in a distant world, made such an impression on Godden, considering how little the nun has featured in our imagination of colonial India. The grave of the nun in Cherrapunji had been turned into a shrine by the villagers who whitewashed it with chuna and made offerings of food and flowers. During the monsoon, the torrential rainfall that Cherrapunji is famous for would have poured over the grave and washed it clean. Nonetheless, it had been overtaken by the local customs and beliefs that the intrepid nun would have dedicated herself to overlaying with Christian values, if not outright conversion. That is the crux of Black Narcissus, the story of a group of 5 British Catholic nuns from the Order of the Servants of Mary, who struggled to establish a convent, a school for teaching children, a lay school for teaching needlework to older girls, a clinic and a dispensary in an isolated outpost called Mopu, high in the eastern Himalayas beyond the colonial hill station of Darjeeling. The characters, the order, and indeed Mopu are all fictional. The nuns are invited to Mopu by General Toda Rai, the local lord, with general being an honorific within his family rather than a military title. He is a scion of a nearby princely state. Although unnamed, it was probably modeled on Nepal. And Mopu was leased to his father, General Ranajit Rai, by the colonial government of India. General Toda Rai loans the nuns the palace that housed the harem of his father for them to convert into the convent of Saint Faith. The nuns are led by the Anglo-Irish Sister Claudia and include Sisters Blanche, also known as Honey, Brioni, Philippa, and Ruth. They seek to transform the place and the lives of the villagers by bringing Christian morals and values as well as Western education and medicine, but find themselves overwhelmed by the setting, the people, and the space. They clash and then come to an uneasy alliance with Mr. Dean, the English agent of General Toda Rai, who is said to have gone native while being highly patronizing towards the villagers. They are sneered at by Angu Aya, the old possessive custodian of the palace. They are forced to put up with a holy man whose hermitage lies just above the palace turned convent, who turns out to be the uncle of General Toda Rai, formerly known as General Krishna Rai, and with the young General Dilip Rai, the nephew and eventual heir of General Toda Rai. It is Dilip's overpowering scent, Black Narcissus, that gives the book its memorable name. He also catches the attention of Kanchi, a local girl foisted on the hapless nuns by Mr. Dean, described as ready to eat. Finally, they are confronted with the children who attend the school and the villagers, who include coolies and workers in the nearby tea estate. The Indian setting triggers of different reactions in each of the nuns. Sister Claudia is tormented by memories of a youthful romance in Ireland, the failure of which drove her to become a nun. Sister Philippa goes overboard gardening, growing flowers instead of vegetables, and neglecting her more mundane duties as well as her faith. Sister Honey becomes overly attached to the children who attend the school. In her eagerness to help an ailing baby, she administers medicine that hastens his death, and the villagers turn their backs on the nuns. By far the most stable, with her passion for cupboards, keys, and the dispensary, Sister Brioni still suffers from ill health. While all these nuns thus display hints of madness brought about by their ill-fated enterprise in the middle of nowhere, Sister Ruth is the one who goes mad after becoming obsessed with Mr. Dean and imagining Sister Claudia to be her romantic rival. The story comes to its climax when she tries to push Sister Claudia off a cliff, but such is a frenzy that she ends up falling herself and dying a dramatic death. The nuns have no choice but to concede defeat and leave. When Godden wrote the book in 1938, just before World War II, India was on the verge of gaining independence. And in her mind, it seemed to be overcoming the colonial presence, rather like Mopu was overwhelming the nuns. In short, the setting becomes a microcosm of India as a graveyard of empire into which the colonial project would be laid to rest, much like Sister Ruth is in Mopu. Her Christian grave is overtaken by the rituals performed and the offerings made by the villagers to placate the bhoot that they believe her to have become, directly inspired by Godden's experience in Cherrapunji. As Anne Chisholm, Godden's biographer, puts it, the nuns are full of confident good intentions, but gradually their confidence and their skills desert them as they come up against the complexity and intractability of local traditions and beliefs and their own limitations. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is that the setting is not portrayed as a complex, dynamic place at all. Paradoxically, the anti-colonial stance that Godden takes in the novel, by which the European nuns are defeated by their Indian setting, is based on orientalizing it as a primeval, unchanging, timeless land. Indeed, Godden ends up reproducing many of the tropes that were used to justify colonialism, which unsurprisingly go hand in hand with anti-feminist ones. One way or the other, readers in the UK and USA were not deterred, and Black Narcissus made Godden's name, remaining in print to date. By the year of India's independence, in a clever marketing move, it was made into a film by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, starring Deborah Kerr as Sister Claudia and Jean Simmons as Kachi in a blackface performance, one of a few of such performances. The film is now considered a masterpiece, and the novel is a classic, the two inspiring a recent 3-part British TV series. While the novel is an imaginative work of fiction containing numerous non-realistic elements, it is often seen to present the larger colonial experience through the prism of the nun. Even if that was not the author's intention, the film and the TV series, it's worth mentioning, are more in the nature of psychological dramas. And the problem with this is that it reduces women religious to a cog in the colonial machine and deprives them of a distinctive character as a whole or agency, not to mention homogenizes the colonial enterprise. It is a fact that colonialism opened the door to different parts of India for real-world nuns, such as those of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, IBVM, better known as the Loreto Sisters, the most prominent order to flourish in India. But it is also worth noting that Loreto's immediate background in Ireland set the nuns apart as a community of European women in India. It is clear that by disseminating Western education and medicine, as well as ideas about hygiene and sanitation, as the superior achievements of the European race among colonial subjects, they furthered colonial goals of intellectual and cultural domination. There is ample evidence to reveal that they ascribed to racist prejudices, Orientalist views, and colonialist ideology. But they were also motivated by a feminist agenda to educate women while taking on a patriarchal Catholic Church. These contradictions lent nuns in colonial India far more complexity than Godden's cultural representation lets on. In perhaps the sharpest contrast to Godden's fictitious nuns who soon decamp, the Loreto sisters stayed on and left one of the lasting legacies of the colonial period in the form of Catholic girls' schools. Thus, it is worth comparing and contrasting the nuns' experience in Black Narcissus, the novel, with that of Loreto sisters as reflected in their archival records, while putting both into historical context for insights into female monastic presence in colonial India and its significance. If a novel by an enlightened progressive Memsaab continues to be the main reference point until today, it is because there is so little awareness about these women religious, hardly finding space in most women's histories of colonial India. Indeed, whereas nuns can be characterized, individualized in a work of fiction, in historical records, they come across as a corporate body, making it difficult to excavate biographies. This talk is based on two works. The main argument was first formulated in an article co-authored by me with Alexandra Virini, which is presently under review with the journal. In fact, we're revising it now. Indeed, the archival research at the Loreto Archives in Dublin was conducted by Verini, and I'm highly grateful to her for generously allowing me to reuse it in subsequent works by me, including a chapter of my forthcoming book and this talk. In the article, we argue that a novel that was hailed for its anti-colonial stance also reinforces Orientalist stereotypes that dovetail with a misogynistic outlook. At the same time, an order that displayed racist and colonialist tendencies also, despite and because of these, was behind a project that had a feminist basis. A comparative study of the novel and Loreto's archival records reveals the ways in which white feminist goals can be at odds with anti-colonialist ones, but it also shows how the regressive portrayal of nuns in the novel is not reflected in the historical record. We make the argument in the course of exploring themes within Catholic colonial feminisms, religious Orientalism, and the Indian landscape. However, my talk is derived from those sections of my chapter which comprise a comparative study of the role of travel and space in the nuns' experience of colonial India. The Loreto sisters were fundamentally itinerant, combining the continental legacy of their original founder, Mary Ward, who founded a string of Catholic schools for girls across Europe in the early 17th century, with the worldwide vision that the institute subsequently came to develop under its immediate founder, Frances Mary Teresa Ball, in the early 19th century, enabled by empire. In Black Narcissus, the nuns are dispatched from Mopu by Father Roberts, probably their Jesuit supervisor, and Mother Dorothea, the provincial mother, on the same note of foreboding that had initially made Ball resistant to the idea of sending Loreto to India, and thus risking the souls and bodies of her religious by sending them to the most unhealthy country where the Portuguese were schismatics and the flock were without a chief pastor, unquote. As Sister Claudia takes her leave from Mother Dorothea, she thinks to herself that they are going into the wilderness to pioneer, to endure, to work. Like Godden's nuns, the Loreto sisters were also expected to do pioneering work and crisscross North India at least to take root in centers and backwaters alike. However, the novel, which is marked by a vivid sense of place and space in an atmospheric work of fiction, the Loreto nuns produced only a few long and elaborate descriptions of their different destinations. Even the accounts of their arrival, of the original group in Calcutta in 1841 do not include the details of the first impressions of India, the usual melee, the strange sights, and the strong smells that preface the memoirs of Mem Sahibs. This is possibly reflective of the difference between the individual identities of British, mainly Protestant ladies, and the approach of Catholic nuns as a whole, who were not supposed to have personalized perceptions. India hit the original Loreto sisters in a different way, and it was reported that although our sisters had been a few months in India, yet the intense heat of its tropical climate already told fatally upon them. One after another, all fell sick and with weakened frames found themselves less able to meet the calls made upon them in every direction. A Sister Alexia might have succumbed even earlier, within 12 days of setting foot in Calcutta. She showed symptoms indicative of decline, and from the period until her death, she was a martyr to ill health, debility, loss of sleep, loss of appetite. For the most part, she was confined to her couch and unable to perform any duty that would require her to move about. A few months later, a Sister Martina was delirious with brain fever, almost dying. She miraculously revived for her Mother Teresa to be felled by fever. Ultimately, 2 of the original group died of cholera. In the novel, while the nuns initially revel in the sublime Himalayan setting of Mopu, gradually their health also begins to break down, and they suffer from aches and pains, tiredness, listlessness, and diarrhea. Increasingly, there's a sense of them being crushed by their setting. The light in Mopu seemed to make the yellowness of their face more yellow against their wimples. Their steps sounded heavy in the clear air. They were not strong enough for the wind. Even their clothes seemed gray and discolored against the whiteness of snow and cloud. Then their unhealthiness broke through their skins in pimples and spots. However, it was not the heat that bothers them, but the cold of the high Himalayan winter. It is reminiscent of the failed colonial enterprise to establish convalescent homes for European troops in the mountains, when the cold and the gloom began to drive the men to suicide. The British had embraced the rarefied climate of the Indian highlands, that is, different mountain chains, as better suited to the so-called European race than the much dreaded heat of the plains, leading to the emergence of a series of hill stations as enclaves established by the British were called. But they flocked to these colonial retreats only during the so-called season corresponding to the summer months. Missionaries followed the trail, and hill stations became a popular choice for setting up schools. Oh, sorry, I'm not showing images. I forgot. Imagine. दिखाएंगे slide. It's terrible. Forgotten about the images. Hmm? No, okay. So missionaries followed the trail, and hill stations became a popular choice for setting up schools, although they would have had to stay put and run their establishments around the year, unlike the seasonal crowd that decamped when the going got tough. Loreto was no exception, and within 5 years since it arrived in India, a community of sisters left Calcutta, the headquarters of the Institute in India, for Darjeeling, the closest hill station. It so happens that Darjeeling was also the closest Loreto came to the metaphorical Mopu. For the first 2 or 3 years, these Loreto sisters too suffered from privations, if not ill health. The difference between the struggles of Godden's nuns and the Loreto ones in the Himalayas is that while the former could not cope with being in a remote, windswept outpost, the latter persevered and established a school in Darjeeling, which endures to date. Next, indeed, Darjeeling was not even a well-developed hill station, a colonial cocoon, when the first batch of Loreto sisters wound their way up to it in 1846. It had been leased by the colonial government only in 1835, and it would take the authorities about 15 years to turn it into a hill station. In 1846, the Loreto sisters had found the trek to be perilous and wearisome. Like Godden's nuns, they had been impressed by the Himalayas and noted that Darjeeling was beautifully situated in the midst of some of the wildest and most romantic scenery for which the Himalayas are so renowned. Nonetheless, Darjeeling was at least on its way to becoming a hill station by the time Loreto discovered it, whereas in keeping with its metaphorical purpose as an unconquerable land, Mopu is devoid of any European presence, with the exception of Mr. Dean, who is in any case portrayed as eccentric. In time, the journey to Darjeeling from Calcutta was reported by the Loreto analysts to be pleasantly accomplished in about 26 to 28 hours. And the so-called Loreto of the Himalayas became a landmark of the hill station. Next, I think. No, back, sorry. The building came to include a compound with terraced gardens and playgrounds for the children. The British obsession for laying out gardens in India took a decided turn in hill stations. The Indian mountains, especially the Himalayas, were originally experienced by the British in terms of the sublime, a notion intended to describe nature in its wildest, most elemental form, inspiring feelings of terror and wonder at once. But to turn chosen spots into hill stations, they had to be rendered in the register of the picturesque, consisting of a more tame version of nature, evoking feelings of delight that nonetheless contained some wild and romantic elements. This involved gaining control of the unruly aspects of the mountains, landscaping the terrain, and building it up to present a picture of British country life. So the British planted trees, flowers, and vegetables evocative of home on the British Isles. Arguably, in the novel, Sister Philippa, the nun in charge of the gardens of the convent, embodies the same tendency to order surroundings by gardening furiously. In the heightened world of Mopu, the nun's dedication takes on an obsessive bent. She begins to have visions of flowers instead of saints and is late to prayers. as she neglects her other far more quotidian duties of doing laundry and tending to the livestock. She herself becomes careless about her appearance, her habit marred by mud stains and even a tear. She dreams of covering the hill behind the convent with daffodils and jonquils, and of an extensive garden with multicolored flowers. She has plans to make rose beds, have a vegetable and a herb garden, and grow creepers. She dismisses any advice from Mr. Dean or Sister Cloda that certain plants may not grow in the climate of Mopu, and finally presents the Sister Superior with seed lists, which leads to a clash between the two nuns. I don't know what's come over you, sister, says Sister Cloda. You bring me these schemes which will cost hundreds of rupees in labor and plants, and you know perfectly well that there is no hope at all of any of them being sanctioned. You must have known it. Sister Philippa receives a jolt, realizes her unhealthy fixation with making a garden of mopu, and asks to be transferred to a more sobering locale. There is a religious connotation to Sister Philippa's downfall. Her focus is on growing vegetables and hence doing something frivolous her focus is on growing flowers and hence doing something frivolous rather than vegetables, which would have been more useful when religious life is supposed to consist of ore et labore, a point that is highlighted in the 1947 film when Deborah Kerr, as Sister Cloda, holds up a plan for a vegetable garden and realizes that Sister Philippa has been planting various ornamental flowers in place of the more utilitarian potato, onion, cabbage, pea, and Rumer bean. But this storyline also collapses the nuns' experience of the mountains into a more generalized colonial one. The Loreto sisters certainly made the most of hill stations, setting themselves up not only in Darjeeling, but also Shillong and even Simla in the Western Himalayas, by then the summer capital of the Raj. A mission that went to Shillong agreed that it was becoming the queen of hill stations, replete as it was with nature's surpassing beauties. But they did not restrict their endeavors to the playing ground of the colonial elite, as hill stations became. Like Godden's nuns, they too forged into remote areas low on Europeans. One such place was Morappai. At the turn of the 20th century, it was a little village 25 miles from Calcutta in the swamps of the Gangetic Plain, that is, the steamy Sundarbans, reached after a 3-hour journey by slow train followed by a boat ride. A community of Loreto sisters arrived there to open a schoolhouse, a church, an infirmary, and a dispensary, almost exactly like Godden's nuns, and strove, quote, to make the pagan children fervent Catholics by planting seeds of faith, unquote. By this time, the sisterhood in India included Indian Christian nuns, and 9 from the Daughters of Saint Anne accompanied 3 European ones to Morappai. Nearly 3 decades later, the institution was going strong, as reported by a newsletter. In the novel, the nuns feel besieged by the local population, not the ones they have to deal with in the process of doing good works, but the rest, who appear a teeming population to a sisterhood of 5. The tea plantation workers, coolies, Tibetan Buddhist monks, and even ponies take shortcuts through the grounds of the convent. And their outlines stand out spectacularly against the skyline, distracting the nuns. What is more, the people took to sitting on the path to watch the nuns. They laughed and talked about them and handed around cigarettes and made a party of it. They embarrassed them acutely. Mr. Dean is unsympathetic when Sister Cloda complains against such intrusions. He impresses upon her that the locals have customary, if not legal, rights, and embarrasses her by reminding her of her Christian duty to be tolerant of her fellow humans. Without another word, Sister Cloda let the people go and come. But every time she saw the line of figures against the sky, her own words seemed to come back to her. And the more she thought of them, the less she liked them. Meanwhile, in Morapai, rather than feeling overwhelmed by the villagers, the Loreto sisters engaged with them with good intentions mixed with paternalistic instincts in a manner more typical of Mr. Dean than the nuns in the novel. He is believed to have gone native. At the same time, his cultural assimilation serves the purpose of lending a certain authority to the condescending attitude he still retains towards the villagers. Disconcerted to find that uh, General Toda Rai had been paying the people to visit the dispensary and the children to attend the school, the sisters inform him and he reassures them by saying, "It's only until it becomes a habit. Let it become a habit for them to come, and they won't remember the time when they didn't. And then gradually he'll leave off paying them, and it will gradually become a habit for them not to be paid. They are not really avaricious. It's the idea of getting presents. They are like children, enormously pleased with money, but they don't really want it. And they have children's memories too." At the Loreto convent in Morapai, the local men were once given the task of cleaning the drinking water tank after the rice harvest failed, even though the sisters were convinced that they were the personification of laziness. The bulletin ended on this cheerful note. We have taken some interesting snaps so that our many friends may form some ideas of this interesting work and learn how primitive are the methods of the happy people of the Morapai mission. Asansol in Bengal was no backwater by the late 19th century, a bustling railway center for a couple of major lines. Nonetheless, it was representative of the Mafusal when Loreto established itself there. The analyst painted a remorseless picture of a nondescript place, a rather unlovely district of rugged fields and dusty roads. The convent was opened along with the St. Francis Xavier's Hindu school at its gate, and a stable and a garage were converted into classrooms. Unlike the children at the school in Mopu in the novel, who had to be bribed by General Toda Rai to attend, on the first day of the school in Asansol, a eager lot of brightly dressed children, their ages ranging from 12 to 2.5 years, turned up, presumably out of curiosity and novelty rather than any financial incentive. If it had taken a disaster in the novel, the death of of a child following Sister Honey's well-meaning but bumbling ministrations for the students to abandon the school in Mopu, school discipline, the requirements to sit still, pay attention, and keep still was enough to drive the children of Asansol out of school by the very next day. They kept absconding until the village headman had to be sent to haul the um, wild folk as they were back into the crowd. The red system occasionally formed bonds with specific children and wards, recalling Sister Honey's with Om and Joseph Anthony, two little boys in Mopu, although the latter was the son of the so-called Madrasi cook of General Todarai in the novel. In Asansol, for example, a toddler calling herself Sancta Maria had attached herself to the Loreto sisters, inserting herself into group photographs of them. But in most cases of such relationships across racial lines, described in the Loreto records, the Indians seem to have endeared themselves by being particularly susceptible to Christian influence and conversion. Thus, the Loreto sisters traveled in different directions in pursuit of their cause on the subcontinent. Naturally, such an extent of travel or diversity of land are not apparent in the novel, as Godden effectively made a case study of Mobu, which comes across as a microcosm or at least a metaphor for India, not as a colonized land, but a primeval one. Hence, it is distinguished from colonial India, which included both those parts that were under the direct rule of the British and princely India that comprised indirectly controlled states. Like General Dilip Rai, his people were fantastic too, heady and strong with their crude, bright clothes and goblin faces, and they also rode these white and dappled stallions. Sister Philippa is convinced that the people of Mopu are like no other they encountered in India in the past, and the nuns are profoundly struck by them. It is because they belong to a mysterious and impenetrable land. After the debacle with the Godden, Sister Philippa, also once described by Mother Dorothea as wise, is the first to realize that their mission is futile. I think there are only two ways to live in this place. You must either live like Mr. Dean or like the sannyasi that General Krishna Rai has become. Either ignore it completely or give yourself up to it. It is also presented as a timeless land, and this is brought out in the repeated references to the cyclic nature of time. Mr. Dean is convinced that the nuns will not last and constantly gives them until the next rains break. Nomadic as the nuns were, at least during their early days in India, while they were still finding their feet, they also had to lay down roots to be able to build convents that endured. If travel gave them the impetus to disseminate their cause, the structures they shaped, adapted, and inhabited anchored them to the different places they traversed. In 1980, the analyst wrote fondly about Loreto and Tali, emphasizing the importance of space to convent life. Next, seen today, it seen today, it is a most imposing and yet a most homely institution. It lies in a hollow and viewed from the railway bridge presents a pleasing sight. The long, lofty range of buildings looking like a town on a small scale. The well-kept grounds, the avenues of noble trees, the groups of children romping, running, or strolling about, and engaged in animated conversations. The whole scene reflected in the clear waters of the beautiful tank in the foreground. At every turn, a devotional statue, a crucifix. Sacred pictures make one realize the world is left outside, and this convent school is one of those homes of prayer and word which God raises up everywhere for the extension of his kingdom on earth. One of the most striking passages in Black Narcissus reflects on the homogenizing efforts of foreign branches of the servants of Mary to replicate their home institution in Canstead, Sussex. Next. In India, Sister Cloda had found the same brick buildings, the same green walls and echoing stone stairs, the same figures of saints in colored plaster, the same close, warm convent smell mixed with incense and wax polish. The reception room had even been laid in wood to match the parakeet at home, and the chapel had been copied exactly from the chapel at Canstead. The corridors were crowded with girls in neat blouses. The white figures of the sisters were everywhere, and there was always a subdued, busy bustle or else deliberate meditative silence. One can imagine that the Loreto sisters would have shared the same concern with recreating their home institutions in India. With the incorporation of while the incorporation of Christian symbols and Catholic icons would have been the key to turning buildings pre-existing or custom-made into convents, arguably the desire to recapture a semblance of home would have drawn missionaries to the hills in particular, especially colonial hill stations, which were in any case supposed to be British ivory towers in India. In the novel, Sister Cloda describes General Toda Rai's offer of his palace as literally God sent, finally giving their order a chance to set themselves up in a cool place. All the hill stations have a convent each, she explains, the comment reflecting the importance of these places to colonial life. In Mopu, of course, the nuns failed to achieve any home-like transformation. If the Himalayan setting portends their failure, the palatial palace facing the mountain range with the Kanchenjunga at the heart of it, exposed to the notorious wind of the place, sets them up for it. In perhaps the most eccentric twist in the novel, providing Godden ample scope for anti-feminist stereotypes. The nuns are supposed to make a convent of a one-time seraglio. It is General Todarai's idea to turn the palace that had housed the harem of his father, General Ranajit Rai, known locally as the House of Women, into the convent of Saint Faith, to exorcise it of its sinful past and ill repute. Indeed, father and son are caricaturized to represent the two polar opposites of the Oriental despot of colonial imagination. Ranajit is the dashing but dissolute prince whose extensive harem is a source of embarrassment to the colonial government and whose sexual proclivities cause him health problems. Meanwhile, Toda is the unattractive and possibly illegitimate son who mindlessly adopts Western notions of progress, welfare, and improvements in awe of his colonial masters. Needless to say, like Mopu has a spirit of its own, so does the palace, imprinted as it is with the activities of a boisterous bunch of wives and concubines, even after they are long gone. After Ranajit dies, Toda is quick to turn them out. He could send them away, but he could not wipe them out. Sometimes it seemed to him that the house had a wild, bad life of its own. The impression of evil lingered. Thereafter, he attempts to rehabilitate his sister Srimati in the palace, but it has a corrupting effect on her, leading to her death. Sister Claudia also feels the mark of the past inhabitants of the palace, ornamental and sexed Indian women of the harem, even after the nuns have taken over, bringing home the incongruity of the space. She seemed to hear the door opened in the night and hear them coming, running, gauze hurriedly twisted around their bosoms, flowers seized and pinned in the hair, feet with anklets chiming, hastening to the door. It follows that for all of the nuns' efforts to convert the palace into a convent, culminating in the installation of the figure of the Sacred Heart in the central salon turned reception room, and the statues of different female saints, including, of course, the eponymous Saint Faith, in the corridor of the new school that takes the place of the West Lawn, they ultimately know that these are surface changes. Mopu gets the better of them. The wind penetrates the palace turned convent and their psyche, shattering the calm. Their rooms look onto vast corridors paraded by servants and workmen, the passages nevertheless having a cavernous feel that seems to devour them. On one of his visits to the convent, Mr. Dean momentarily feels detached from the space before he runs into Angu Aya and realizes that the frigid air of the convent does not disguise the reality that the space remains unchanged. Meanwhile, the first of the Loreto sisters received a palace too, in Calcutta, to set up their headquarters in India. The records include detailed descriptions of the space and the steps taken by the sisters to convert it into a convent. The fundamental difference between the actual home in Calcutta and the imaginary one in Mopu is that while the latter stood in a remote outpost, the former was located in the European part of Calcutta, the capital of East India Company's Indian Empire, with commanding views of the business of empire rather than bare mountaintops. Indeed, the latter was an Indian palace, whereas the former had been a palatial colonial home. It had a storied history, having been the house of Sir Elijah Impey, the Chief Justice of the Calcutta Supreme Court, and his wife Mary, Lady Impey, in the late 18th century. Next. Oh. Next. There are 3 paintings commissioned by the Impeys themselves, 2 by Indian artists and 1 by the European Johann Zoffany, that provide views of the lavish colonial home and lifestyle of the Impeys. The first 2 are set in vast rooms, a hall that leads into a bedchamber in the case of one, and the nursery in the other. Next. Both rooms consist of high pale walls decorated with moldings in neoclassical patterns, interspersed with tall shuttered doors and windows in blue or green. In the first, pichla wala, in the first, Lady Impey dominates as she sits on a footstool in the center, surrounded by Indian male secretaries, servants, and tradesmen, and one European footman. Next. In the second, the three youngest children of the Impeys are attended by one Dai, a wet nurse, and four ayahs, while two young manservants hover around. Next. The conversation piece by Zoffany is set on a terrace where the master and mistress, along with their children, are entertained by a troupe of Indian musicians while attended by two Indian male bearers and two ayahs. One of the children is dressed in Indian clothes and dances in the center. Sir Elijah claps along, but Lady Impey is flopped in a chair to one side, looking worn out. The neoclassical architecture of their house is apparent in the traces of an arch, a column, and a capital bearing a gargoyle and the balustrade. The description in the Loreto record suggests that the house retained its palatial splendor 6 decades since the Impeys held fort. The sisters could take a turn on the flat roof in the evening and revel in the bracing breeze that blew in from the Hooghly. Next. The view encompassed shipyards, Fort William, and the site of the Black Hole, as well as the Park Street, which was in fact named after the park that was once attached to the Impey House, with the new beautiful palace of the Archbishop of Calcutta. A trellised passage covered with creepers comprised the entrance into the house-turned convent, and there was a garden in front and one at the back. The impression of terraces and verandas that the painting by Zoffany gives is reiterated in the description. Okay. The interiors were equally impressive. Bright and airy, with everything tending to promote coolness and to exclude the tropical sun as much as possible. There is talk of Doric pillars with carved capitals and walls and ceilings decorated with moldings. The two huge ballrooms were converted into a study hall and a community room for the nuns. There were two rooms on either side of the study hall with semicircular ends, one of which could have been the Impey's nursery, since it is depicted with a semicircular apse. The first of the sisters to occupy the house was stunned by the banquet that was laid on for them. All the appointments were in the last style, and the candelabras shone with wax light, and the richly furnished cells they were shown into, attended by an ayah. The fact that such a fine historical house was purchased for Loreto reflects the clout of the Catholic community on the one hand, and the status conferred on the sisters, even without the official support of the predominantly Protestant company and later colonial state. It was this valorization of the Institute's mission to bring about Christian awareness as well as Western education for women in India that enabled Loreto to spread rapidly in India and over time recruit Anglo-Indian and even Indian Christian women into their ranks. Yet a different account in the Loreto records of the arrival of the sisters in Calcutta and at the house describes their unease with the luxurious palace. I'm not going to go over the examples because I'm running out of time. Besides revealing, okay, it was noted that it was purchased and decorated at great expense. One round mahogany cost 700 rupees. Even a carriage and horses were procured. In the end, their hearts yearned for their simple selves at home. When the ceremonies of etiquette were over, they gladly shut out the world and retired to pray and to rest. Besides revealing the standard longing for home in this manner, in their official stance, the Loreto sisters claim the high moral ground and set themselves apart from the corrupting Oriental excesses, much like Godden's nun could never make a home in an Indian palace that had once housed a harem. Having said that, it can be argued that Godden takes a reductionist view to all women's spaces in the form of a zinana and a convent, contrasting the two to bring out Oriental conflict between Eastern and Western values of body against mind, sex against repression, as pointed out by Amanda Coe, the writer of the recent TV series adaptation of Black Narcissus. Ranjit's women are said to lose control, left to their own devices, especially after the instrument of patriarchal control, his legitimate wife, dies, whereas the nuns are helpless without Mr. Dean. It is worth noting that while the Zinana was ultimately a patriarchal, even misogynistic institution, it could also offer women a safe and secure environment to exercise agency. However, in this case, it is portrayed as a den of vice and licentiousness, and the entry of Kachi, described as luscious, is a throwback on older times. Meanwhile, any feminist agenda the sisters may have had to educate local women is second to their Christian and indeed colonial high handedness. Gordon's take in comparing the sexualized environment of the harem and the sexless one of the convent also leaves no room for shared or even similar experiences as organized women's communities. It was, in fact, much earlier, at the turn of the 19th century, when a high Memsahib, Lady Henrietta Clive, the wife of Lord Edward Clive, the governor of Madras Presidency, was reminded of a convent every time she visited the zinana of a defeated Indian ruler. In spite of all the spatial overlaps between the real and fictional nuns, such as the patronage of the powerful or prosperous, the attempts to recreate convents in Britain or Ireland, the former seem to have had a more adaptable attitude and been more effective in their appropriation of different spaces. The latter are time and time again rendered ephemeral. The Loreto sisters did not only inhabit hill stations and grand homes, but also made do with, as references to converting stables and garages into classrooms suggest. The single mindedness of mission that rooted the Indian branch of Loreto is simply not reflected in Gordon's nuns. Although it has to be said, once again, that the author does not seem to have been concerned with representing the nuns' specific experience of colonial India. The novel comes across as more of a mediation on colonial rule, and the women religious are incidental to the plot, which has the same inadvertent effect of undermining their mission in India, in itself a product of a global Catholic missionary agenda rather than a merely colonial one. I have about one paragraph concluding all the conclusions. Shall I do that? I'm also almost out of breath. To be sure, there is common ground between the experiences of the Loreto sisters, the possibility that the former inspired the latter prefigures. Their outlook towards Indian women was more or less the same, steeped in colonial stereotypes. A cascading comparative view of their approaches to the Indian landscape, the places they traveled to within the subcontinent, the spaces they occupied, reveals similarities and divergences at once. A comparison between the history of Loreto, India, and the story about nuns by Rumer Godden also reveals the different voices and agendas of colonial women. For example, Mary Ward's feminist mission was redefined by the Loreto sisters in India, in part as the white women's burden. They imagined onus on British women to uplift Indian ones. Yet the Irish background of the sisters and their success in promoting women's education in India added unique dimensions to their position. Meanwhile, the anti-colonial point of view of an old India hand is diluted by its recourse to Orientalist ideas. Moreover, it is anti-feminist in its portrayal of both Indian women and European nuns. Thank you. Really? Thank God, I thought I went on and on.
Thanks, Yashaswini. It's fascinating. I mean, I never thought about where the Loreto convent came from. And it's so normalized into India's educational landscape to have convent schools, as they're called, quite divorced from now both the colonial project as well as any kind of a Christian mission.
Yes.
I don't know. I didn't study in a school like that, but almost all my friends did, and I'm sure it seems very far from the beginnings of where these institutions started out. Please, it's open for questions. And as promised, I think Yashaswini does manage to sort of knit together many of her different interests in history and in women's studies, as well as in literature and in colonialism. So it's all there. Only the animals are missing, maybe. Please.
Black Narcissus film is also good.
Black Narcissus, but
So
very
is,
early film from
1947. It was released in 1947 and
with
in the time-
blackface.
Yeah, with quite a few blackface performances. I think there was
Uh.
only one Indian actor. And so the ending, which is actually a pretty accurate depiction of the ending in the novel, in which all these nuns leave, was supposed to have particularly struck a chord because it was supposed to represent the British departure from India.
Mm.
Yeah, it does. It came some 20 years after the novel. And Rumer Godden herself was not apparently very happy with the film. She wanted it shot on location. It was shot in very elaborate sets, and she found all the depictions of the mountains in the Kanchenjunga, inauthentic. And apparently, she was not very happy. There have been actually a lot of research. There's been a lot of writing on the films as well, because the film and the the TV series, because they are so. Especially the film is considered such a classic too. Quite recently, some 2-3 years ago.
So just a speculative question, is in your reading then, to follow up on what the remarks made by Ananya, is the convent a successfully decolonized project?
In the present context.
Through the lens of colonization and decolonization, is it an institution that has remarkably decolonized so that there's no link to this history anymore other than in the history books?
I won't say it's remarkably decolonized. I mean, it's run now by Indian nuns. But like, for example, I think the ideal of white femininity is still prevalent. So there is a certain notion of femininity, at least until I went to one of these schools, that was being promoted, about a certain decorous behavior that was still an orderliness, that was still upheld. And all that, yeah.
Very deep Victorian morality at play, no?
Yes.
In this transformation that takes place.
Yes.
And how does then this play of morality work across these three avatars of the story?
So that
Must be marked differences because they have traveled.
That's a good question. And actually, that is the aspect that Catholic feminisms is an aspect that we've looked at in this paper that we've co-authored. And it's very interesting because the attitude to Indian women is reflected even in the novel, as sort of unruly, highly sexed women who needed to be tamed and controlled and made more orderly. And that, I mean, Mary Ward herself, the original founder of, the Loreto Institute, she herself promoted a certain kind of behavior. Women should not be excessively passionate. They should be differential to their parents, and they should maintain a certain virginal decorum. And that attitude was instilled even in the ethos of Loretos across the world. And that is something also, especially in the treatment of Kanchi, the attitude towards her, that is very much also reflected in the novel. And in the film, of course, it becomes very vivid, because you have like the palace suddenly is painted with murals of like, of like Indian concubines, with, sort of semi-nude female figures and stuff. So that's even more overblown. No, they don't. No, they just go by the novel. Yeah.
So this setting of the convent in the former harem.
It's very eccentric.
No, but it's a very rich, it's kind of a rich site for all the obvious sorts of cultural clashes and the sexual politics of a particular kind of mission Christianity and so on.
Yeah, which is why we have to also remember that at the same time, Rumer Godden, it is very much a work, and it's
Of fiction.
It's very much a work of fiction.
Yeah.
It's just that it ends up representing, nuns in India in a very particular way. And it also ends up representing a lot of the same attitudes that were prevalent in colonial India at the time. But not necessarily the specific experience of nuns.
So, do you think that it's the fact that it's a Catholic order that somehow puts it at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the British Empire? I mean, if it had been some other sort of nun, I don't know, there are Anglican nuns or something.
There
like
are,
this.
but they're very few.
Or they had been Scottish nuns or something like this. Would that have would that have made them somehow more familiar and more palatable as part of the imperial mission? Or in a sense they're both sort of, they're at odds with both the empire and the Indian setting, perhaps more so because of their Catholicism, or is that not the case?
No, that is actually quite important, because
Yeah.
that does distinguish them.
Uh-huh.
Because they operate in India, and they manage to flourish in India and set themselves up in India in spite of not receiving any official patronage.
Mhm, mhm.
And it does also the Irish background.
Right.
It's these elements do set them apart. So again, it is just reflective of another kind of colonial experience.
Right. But you could say that as Irish Catholic nuns, I mean, they themselves are somehow marginal
They are, yeah,
within the
absolutely.
colonial kind of political economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's also an eccentric choice on the part of Godden to try and represent the colonial experience through these nuns.
Right. Right. And are you supposed to feel sympathy for them?
In the book,
Yeah.
you're supposed to feel sympathy for nobody.
No, but who suffers more? The
Well,
natives or the nuns or
the natives go back to the way they were. They go
I
back
see.
to the simple, uncomplicated, wondrous life in the middle of nowhere. Just like the natives. No, they are supposed to be sort of immutable. They're supposed to be eternal.
like nature itself.
Like nature itself, like India. The British think that they made a mark, and the British think that they've had this impact in India, but they finally leave with their
Right.
tails stuck between their legs. And India goes back to being timeless and wonderful. And that's how Mopu is also going to revert to its original state. Which is why it is also in a way an anti-colonial novel. It's just that it sort of plays into Orientalist stereotypes at the
Mhm,
same time. Hmm.
Sorry, I was, thinking of the geographical spread of convents, uh, schools for men, boys, and, colleges, St. Xavier's, of course. It's a prominent chain, as it were, and convents for girls and women. So, what is the proportion generally? In the sense, there is a relationship that you are drawing between the, summer locations where these schools spring up or convents spring up. But they're also, main in the main, in the non-hilly terrains, as it were, in the plains. You have lots of them.
Yes.
But is there a portion? I mean, do they care more about men than they care about, girls who need to be educated and reformed? What was the, of course, education, clinic, etc., etc. All of this is part of that agenda, and these are eternal, as it were, agendas. But is there a definite emphasis on which one to, is there a preferential treatment in terms of, I mean, what does the literature?
So it
tell us?
evolves. It evolved. Initially, they're supposed to educate European Catholic girls. Then they start taking in Eurasian girls. Then they start, taking in sort of poor Indian girls, orphans. Then a certain prestige gets attached to these schools. Progressive Indian families want to send their daughters. So they start taking in Indian girls. And like I said, they were feminist because there was some sort of a rule at some point that certain percentage had to be Europeans and only a very small percentage could consist of Indian girls. So about 25% or so. And they found a way to circumvent it. So they would say that they're giving them medical training or some training in first aid or something of that sort, and find ways to circumvent these rules so that over time, access to the Loretos became more and more diverse. So it changes, it varies. And also a lot depended on endowments. Like, so there was a major endowment from a couple of prosperous Eurasian sisters for specifically Eurasian women to get educated, I think, at Loreto and Dali.
Those that are also Christian.
So that's interesting. And the Christian connotation, I didn't look at. But the thing is that this sister Ruth, she dies, and she dies a very dramatic death because she falls off a cliff, and she sort of falls on the spiky end of like a bamboo, Yeah, she's impaled literally through the heart, and so it's a very Christian death. And she has a very dramatic death. But she's buried, and she is considered to have become a bhoot who needs to be appeased. And Sister Claudia imagines the ghosts of all those concubines and wives who had inhabited that harem.
Catholic schools all my
Yeah.
life. And I didn't find any sense of any colonial hangover at all.
Oh, really?
Except that middle class Indians thought that fathers and brothers were better at disciplining than others. And one of the reasons why they sent the middle class kids there was ki discipline ho jayega. But other than that, I didn't find any difference between schools run by brothers and fathers, pitai ke alawa, than other schools.
No, well, I think because, like I said, in the case of women, it was based on a certain ideal of white femininity.
And even this was based on a certain ideal of discipline. That I'm not saying that it wasn't there, but it's a notion of discipline that had very much been adopted by the Indian middle class. It
Right.
had its roots
Right.
in something,
Right,
quite
right.
obviously,
Right,
but it's something that had become part of the Indian middle class.
right.
So in that sense, it has no longer seemed foreign.
Right. But I don't know whether it seemed foreign. It seemed like I went to one of these Loreto schools to begin with, and then I went to a very different kind of school. And the contrast to me was very stark because you were expected to behave and conform in a very specific way, the way you dress, the way, even your like deportment, the way you conducted yourself, the way you spoke. You weren't supposed to speak loudly. You were not supposed to have a high pitched voice. You weren't supposed to talk about boys or think about boys. That was really sort of instilled in you. And I remember you weren't even supposed to speak in Hindi in lunch intervals. You were supposed to speak in English. So there were, obviously I didn't critically analyze it then, but when you think back, and especially because I went to a very different kind of school, it seemed quite marked.
You have a question? Where did you come from? I mean, from DU, from elsewhere, from Sarai. Oh, okay.
Oh, you were
All right.
Korean. You were Korean.
It came out of the basement. Actually, so Yashaswini, what are you planning? I mean, I know you're saying that you presented another paper here with
That was the broader outline of the book.
of
that
the
I'm
book.
planning.
So you're
This is
basically going to
one
go
chapter.
go through different sorts of
Types of women, yeah.
In colonial India.
Yeah, women, yeah. Different categories of women.
Right. And you say, well, so I guess I mean, from what you describe of your overall project, and from what I remember of your other talk, there is, there you go across classes, and across race and across social settings and workspaces.
Absolutely.
Right. And so there's not always going to be a kind of religious dimension to this at all, by
not
any means.
necessarily, Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
so,
there will be another chapter on lay Protestant missionaries, but that's a very I mean, apart from these two chapters, I don't particularly look at religious women.
So you say homes, gardens, clubs, churches, convents, workhouses, hospitals, sanatoriums.
I did
schools,
say it's ambitious.
So it's I mean, it's so many different sort of social locations and institutional settings in a sense. So tell us a little bit about your archives and how they range broadly, how you range broadly through different sorts of archives. Or
well, to begin with, like you pointed out, I work across a diversity of sources. History, art history, then spatial theory, and
I remember seeing those impy pictures in a show in London.
The Wallace collection.
The Wallace collection. Yeah, I remember seeing those women. I mean, those little children being whatever disciplined in some space, managed in a space. Yeah.
So so first of all, I'll work across sources, and as far as archives are concerned, I think the major archives will obviously be the British Library and the Center of South Asian Studies in Cambridge. Then Scotland has a lot of private archives. The University of Edinburgh itself has sort of the records of Scottish missionaries, these sort of archives. Then I mean, as far as women, then institutional archives, like in the case of Loreto, there are the master archives in Dublin. Then even the different Loretos in India have little archives of their own. So I suppose that is the kind of archives I look at. Then private archives, I look into private archives. I mean, at one point, because I also want to try and study, include groups like Ayahs or British soldiers' wives. I'll probably have to try and look at regimental records, letters. Yeah. And like a lot of the fact of the matter is, while Mem Saabs may not be central to my book, they will constitute only one category. Even their records can be read against the grain for insights into these other communities of women.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
One thing I want to ask you about is how you decided that you wanted to study this topic through the lens of the novel, and why you wanted to approach it through that angle rather than more of a focus on the film or the TV series, or just studying directly in novels or film contrast with kind of these, I guess, more direct historical approach.
Right. So like I said, Rumer Godden herself was not too thrilled with the film. And the film ultimately became the basis of this TV series. And they are more in the nature of psychological dramas. The film was sort of reinvented as a psychological drama. So it becomes a colonial backdrop, whether an anti-colonial stance or Orientalist stereotypes. This is clearly not a concern really in the film. It just provides the exotic backdrop for this psychological drama about nuns. Oh, is that? I didn't know that. Okay, okay. Yeah, so I wouldn't be able to, and especially because Rumer Godden is writing as a mem saab. She's writing as the product of an Anglo-Indian family. Her father served in India. She married in India. She had much of a writing career in India. I think she finally left at independence or just before independence. Then even her sisters had, long runs in India. So, right. So she's also representing a colonial voice, and an interesting colonial voice, because she was also known to be anti-colonial in her outlook. So that is why I thought the novel would be the right would provide the right framework.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. Following this question, I think I know you like the audience are not strictly academic audience. Your public is a multiple public. We all know that. No. A narrative. Yeah. So this is not actually a question, but it is interesting to, the manner in which you have designed your paper. And something that comes to my mind is basically the question of your methodological priorities. Now, in this case, a coherence is made in different, one side of one element is linked to another element by looking at different piece of evidence which are not conventional history piece of thing, like a film, like a novel, etc. And this coherence is provided in order to communicate a narrative which is very clear, which is very visible, and in between you are showing certain slides, meaning that you are also visualizing the narrative. Now, it reminds me a very interesting experiment done by Satyajit Ray in Shatranj Ke Khiladi. Now, in Shatranj Ke Khiladi, the experiment is like that there is a story which is a very badly written story. Premchand's story is very badly written story. If you read the story, you really don't like it, even if you are a Premchand fan. But this narrative is constructed in such an interesting manner that he communicates the context in such a beautiful way that whenever he wants to, link one element with another element, he goes to archives. For instance, Ahdanama is shown, the original photograph of that agreement is shown in order to establish a link. Similarly, he tried to show, you do not find any wire while in the outdoor shooting. You cannot, trace a single wire in the entire film, though this film was made in 1970s and Lucknow was pretty developed at that point of time. But his camera angle and things like that. So you communicate a story in this way that you rely on the context, and whenever you find it difficult to communicate the context, you go back to archive and you dig up a piece of evidence and link it. Now again, it is because he, like you, is also communicating to multiple publics. No. Thank you. Yeah. So the question is the public. What is your public when you construct this type of story, which is you just presented?
So it was shot on location, meaning not on sets. Because this wire problem can be solved if you have a set.
Yeah.
Hmm.
This is not set.
So it's really shot in Lucknow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Outdoor. So beautiful. Means you not find any fire
Right.
in any.
But that was also back in the day, na? Less wires.
In the 70s, no.
Steaming.
Fire.
Acha. So, I know, thank you for that question. The thing is that, well,
Because we're going streaming.
oh, right.
Unless we use mics.
Okay. Okay. So basically, in any case, I like to work with a diversity of sources, art historical for sure, and then of course historical. And the correspondence, the interplay between history and literature, I think can be very revealing. So in the past also, I've drawn those sort of comparisons. And because it's a women's history of colonial India, it's not just about what happened. It's not just about documented history. It's also about how certain impressions got formed and how certain stereotypes developed and how a certain picture of women's roles in the colonial enterprise came about. So it's that the cultural representation is also important. And I have always, I think, my concern with like space or the visual element or my use of images, of course, has to do with my background in art history. And I've even in the previous book that I wrote, The Tale of the Horse, one of the things I think that worked for it is my use of diverse sources, because especially also when you dealing with sort of more marginal groups, whether animals or women, and even within women, certain classes and communities of women, you can't just rely on textual sources. You have to find other sources also, and sometimes visual ones can be very revealing. I mean, I've read some wonderful articles about ayahs, and because again, they're not producing documents of their own. Very few documents about them are being produced. So I read, I think yeah. I think the volume that was co-edited by you and Nitin Sinha. Oh, sorry. So Nitin Verma and Nitin Sinha co-edited those volumes, and there were some articles about ayahs. Then I've read other articles about ayahs too, in which the main sources are visual ones, paintings and portraits of ayahs. So I think I think that's how it comes about. And you're right, because I am writing not just for an academic audience, I'm also writing for a general audience. And my concern is with engaging them as much as possible. I also have to try and produce an evocative narrative. So
Now, I get the sense that you are not really elaborating upon certain judgments that you're passing on the text, the narrative. And I'm yet to understand what is the basis of this judgment. When you say that this is anti-feminist, right? I don't really get a sense from the narrative that you have constructed so far. And I have to rely on your judgment only. So is that a good reading of the way you are presenting it right now? Because, there can be stereotypes. And I mean, one stereotype can be different from another stereotype. So what kind of stereotype it is that you encounter in this text?
So, well, like I said, this is first of all an initial draft, and this is only half of a larger study. And And there are aspects that I have focused, like, for example, the attitude of Godden's nuns and the similar attitudes of Loreto sisters towards Indian women is something that is dealt with in much greater depth in the article. So that's one side of it. But having said that, I thought that I gave some pretty concrete examples, like, the treatment of the harem, the juxtaposition between the harem and the convent, the way in which those women are described, the way in which even the way the nuns are approached. I thought that I did provide some concrete evidence of why I've come to this view, but you will get an even fuller picture in the fullness of time when you're able to read the article and also look at the chapter. I would have actually liked to make so I've been affiliated for over a year, and I would have actually liked to present my work in much greater detail a bit later. But because I'm leaving, this is like my valedictory talk. I will come back and present some more. Oh, how can you? How can you?
A very small one. This is related to the stereotypes about the concubines harem. Or stereotypes in general. Say, for example, the stereotype of brothel or this kind of sexually promiscuous place, which is also a stereotype. Many of the times in the satirical writings, this is often compared with a space which is marked by egalitarianism.
By
Equality, social equality. Anybody can go and enter and be there. So the point that I want to underline is that stereotypes, although appear very stereotyped, ahistorical, but contextually they convey very different kinds of meanings, and also they're mobilized for different kinds of purposes. One concrete example is that railway space as a egalitarian space is often compared with similar kind of space. So basically, anybody can enter into it, no matter whether you're a Brahmin or a Sudra or Dalit or so forth. So they both are similar.
Okay, good.
Okay, well, thank you so much, all of you, for your enthusiastic engagement with Yashaswini's
No, thank you.
paper. And
Thank
thank
you
you,
so much.
Yashaswini, for giving us your valedictory address. And all the luck to you as you travel into new experiences in the post-colonial
But I
UK.
can never leave.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.